Hi, I'm Dustin Rollins, and now we are going to conclude Plato's Republic. So in Book 8, Socrates criticized democracy socially in that it allows individuals to make decisions about things that they're not fully knowledgeable about. In most areas of our life, we expect expert training from individuals who that we're connected to. So like my physician, my teachers, my police officers, we expect them to be trained in how to do their job before we allow them to do their job. But with elected officials, it's not always the same because they don't have to demonstrate competency in political science in order to be elected. Socrates finds this strange, and he feels like in the wrong set of circumstances that could lead to a kind of breakdown of society. Just make it inefficient at best, and at worst it could actually, the ignorance of a leader could potentially destroy a community, just like the ignorance of a physician could potentially be fatal to their patient. Psychologically, he compares democracy to license, the kind of freedom to feed all aspects of our mind without really understanding the consequences for our mind of doing that. It's kind of like that we're free to wander between appetites without really thinking about how they're going to affect us long term. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. You might get lucky and not get in any trouble that way, just like some social democracies are quote unquote lucky by not having a leader make a critical mistake. But given enough time, both social and psychological democracies will decline into tyrannies. And that is Socrates' point, that just as an oligarchy became a democracy will eventually become a tyranny. So in a social tyranny, it's pretty clear what happens. The state is mismanaged, it's desperate, and democratically, tyrants are elected because they promise broad, sweeping reforms. Executive power is expanded to empower them to execute these reforms, at which point, instead of actually doing what they promised, they don't. They instead seize power and stay into control as long as they can. Now, what is wrong with that? Well, that's a complete inversion of what it was supposed to be. It was supposed to be one or many wise rulers governing the entire state for the well-being of the entire state. And it's now become one citizen ignorant of what the state is, governing the state for his or her own self-interest. So, as you could probably suspect, Socrates says these eventually decline as well due to mismanagement. Psychological tyranny is the one that he is really interested in because it becomes the basis of his argument that to live a happy life, we need to be just. So a psychological tyranny is when one appetite takes over your mind for the sake of itself. So your desire for recognition, or your desire for power, or for sex, or for alcohol. These are the kinds of desires he explicitly references in Book 9 as potential tyrants in us. Collectively, these drives exist in us as part of a collective, just like socially speaking. The social community has a lot of different parts, each with their different jobs, and they sort of cohabitate together through mutual exchange. Psychologically, each of us is a bundle of these motives or drives. And in his perfect community, we would have to kind of understand how each affects another, right? The wise ruler would need to understand how all the different aspects of society are interconnected. And the wise person would need to understand how all of the different aspects of themselves are interconnected. Now, that was his version of it. In democracy, we become free to indulge in desires without really understanding their consequence. So for example, you start drinking at a young age without really understanding what it's doing to your brain, or how you're slowly forming a habit, which, if unregulated, can become a more serious issue later in life. So we're free to do these things, but we're ignorant of their effect on us. He says this is how psychological tyrannies are formed. Because we were free to start trying something, we go ahead and try it, and we could get hooked on it or stuck on it. So that master appetite can become the dominant aspect of our psychology. So just as social tyrants govern the state for their own self-interest, a tyrannical appetite will govern a human mind for its own purposes, even if that means the slow decay of the rest of the mind. And so that's how he describes a psychological one who suffers from psychological tyranny. It's that each of the appetites is sort of narrow-minded. They're focused on their own objective. So my desire for food is focused on food. My desire for wine is focused on wine. But that means that those desires are neither interested or knowledgeable about the other desires, or how the community of a person's mind needs to coexist in order to function. Each of these appetites is focused on its own self-satisfaction, and for this reason, they don't make the best rulers of the mind. So what happens is that, socially speaking, the social tyrant actually kind of starts to look around at the different parts of the community and evaluate their worth based upon their relationship to that tyrant's will. Anyone who's found in the state who doesn't conform to how the tyrant wants people to think about the state is usually removed from the state one way or the other. It's kind of like saying, I'm a dictator, this is my country, you're the librarian, you're only going to contain books in the library that tell the history of our nation like I want it to be told. It's a kind of censorship in reference to keeping that tyrant in power, and actually keeping everyone else oppressed. Now, if you suffer from a psychological tyranny, something similar happens. Some of your other desires can be suppressed. Priorities that we used to have before we became tyrannical of mind, these priorities can kind of die off. So for example, if you were once your family was your priority, but then you develop a tyrannical appetite and your family tries to get you to stop doing what it is that you're doing, sometimes instead of stop doing what you're doing, we can sort of sometimes stop being active parts of our family. So that tyrannical part of you will distance itself from anything that contradicts it. Any relationships, any jobs, any hobbies, things that distract from its own purpose. What's more is that it can actually affect our ability to think clearly. So that when we try to think about our own identities, we sometimes have a biased, filtered view of who we are. Just as in social tyrannies, the citizen of a tyranny sometimes has a biased, censored view of what the state is. So that sometimes our tyrannical appetite can grow so strong that it compromises our capacity for rational thought. So if I think about who am I and what is important to me, I don't think about things in a way that will contradict what it is that my master appetite wants. Okay, so it's almost as if in psychological tyrannies, a person's entire inner world is redefined with a new focal point. It's like the center of gravity used to be these one things, but now it's this one thing, and everything else in the psychic world will start to rotate around that. All right, so now this brings us to the first argument that the just life is a happier life. And it has to do with the implication of tyranny for one's rational faculty. Socrates argues that voluntary action, like our capacity to voluntarily act, to offer consent, our very free will, Socrates argues that these powers are housed in our rational faculty. It's our capacity for reflective thought and analysis that allows us to choose any course of action or behavior freely, because we can do so with full knowledge of the consequence of that choice. That makes the action free, is because we can understand what it means for us. That ability to understand is connected to our rational thought. So, here's the problem. Psychological tyrants, because their rational faculty has been compromised, because they can't see themselves or anything else clearly, in a way, that tyranny takes away the capacity for rational thought. But rational thought was the basis of free action. So it would seem that tyrants of mind lack free will, because they're, if you will, enslaved to their own desire. Okay, so then Socrates says, happiness involves free will. That you cannot ever call anyone happy who lacks the capacity for free choices. And you should think about that. I mean, could you be happy if you lack the ability to be free in all areas of your life? And if you say no, you're right, Socrates, happiness needs free will. And if you say, well, and you're right, Socrates, that free will actually depends upon clarity of thought, of understanding what I'm consenting to. And if you also agree that the height of injustice is when your desire becomes so strong that it takes away the ability to be rational, then he's offered his argument that if you are unjust, you cannot be happy, because that injustice works against some of the underlying conditions on which happiness is built, namely rationality and free will. And that's the first argument for why being a just person will lead to be a happier person. I don't know if it's right to say it guarantees that you'll be happy. It's just that being unjust guarantees that you will not be happy, according to the argument. And the same works for states. It's hard to say that a tyrannical state is happy, like a state that is governed by a tyrant, because it is, if you will, enslaved to that tyrant's will. It can only exist insofar as the tyrant allows it. And as a whole, the state really isn't happy. And even from the tyrant's perspective, the state slowly falls apart until their own government fails, at which point they're not happy either. So, both social and psychological tyrannies, Socrates argues, are miserable. And just societies at least have and psyches both have the foundation for an enduring happiness. Okay, now there's two more arguments. The second argument is not my favorite, I'll tell you that right now, but it is interesting to think about. He says that, going back to the myth of metal story with gold, silver, bronze kinds of citizens, if you ask each of them which life is the happiest, they will all probably say their own. So what we need to figure out is an objective criterion by which to judge the question, which is happiest. Because if you just ask them their opinion, they're going to say their own. So he then says, well, I know what objective criteria we might use. Experience, that you have experienced all three lives would help, that you learn from those experiences, and that you can formulate those experiences and articulate them in argument. So once Glaucon and Adeimantus accept those criterion, Socrates then proceeds to say, and it is only the golds, right, the wise, who have actually had the experiences of the other two kinds, but the other two kinds do not have the experiences of the gold, right? Because if you will remember back, in order to become a gold, you had to first be a silver, and in order to be a silver, you first had to exist as a bronze, so that the silvers and golds sort of emerge out of them. So a bronze wouldn't have tasted of the pleasures associated with, let's say, metaphysics or the mind, and yet the golds would have tasted both those higher pleasures as well as the more material ones. And so if the question were who is in a better position to judge which is more satisfying, Socrates says we all have to admit that the golds are in a better position to say which is more satisfying, and they say they're wrong. So it's not the best argument, but he essentially says the just person's life is the happiest because they deem it to be so, and they alone are in a position to know what they're talking about that question. So yeah, maybe you find that argument convincing. That's not my favorite. The third argument is a little bit better, and it goes back to the divided line. So Socrates argues that, he argues that the more real something is, the more power it has to act as a cause in relation to something else. So the more effectual it can be. So that something's capacity to cause is connected to how much being or reality it has. So if you are absolutely nothing, if we're talking about pure nothingness, that thing has no power. Nothing doesn't have any power. It has no being. It has no ability to cause. So from nothing comes nothing, right? So nothing can only do one thing. It can cause more nothing. So absolute being, right? Being itself, the transcendent form of the good that we talked about in the divided line in the cave allegory. Well, because that thing is absolute being, it can do everything. So it's omnipotent. It would be all powerful. Okay, so the more real something is, the more of a cause it can be, the less real, less. He then applies this logic to pleasure. Less real things can cause less real pleasure. More real things can cause more real pleasures. And the more real the object is, the more intense and satisfying is the pleasure that is connected to it. So if you go back to thinking about the divided line and take a picture of a loved one, like looking at that picture, it is sometimes satisfying. And that's great. But it's less satisfying than being with that person sometimes. And even hanging around with somebody is sometimes less satisfying than that deep connection you have with them when you really, really get to know them well. So as you progress up the divided line, things become more real and more satisfying. A very, very clear example is like bodily pleasure versus spiritual pleasure. Pleasures of the body are real, but if he's right, since the body is less real than the soul or mind, pleasures connected to the body are also less real than the soul or mind, and therefore less satisfying and fulfilling. Okay, so to make a long story short, if you could somehow exist mainly in the top half of the divided line, in the spiritual realm of metaphysical being, that should feel really good, because the realest part of you, namely your soul, would be affected by the realist aspects of other things, and that is better and more real and more satisfying than when the less real part of you, your body, interacts with other less real bodily things. Now, how does this connect back to justice? Well, seemingly, it requires a rational faculty to be functioning in order to discern these higher metaphysical beings that could be so satisfying. So you have to be able to take together, for example, all of your experiences of a person, let's say your best friend, and you use your rational faculty to abstract their identity, and then you maybe love them for that, and that's very satisfying because you love them for who they really are. But notice what would have happened there. You would need to have been able to process information clearly and distinctly and without bias. If a person is unjust, their rational faculty has been compromised. And if that is true, then it seems that they cut themselves off from those higher metaphysical pleasures. So unjust people can have pleasure, but it's material pleasure that they can have. Whereas just individuals can have both material pleasures, but also those higher pleasures of mind or spirit. And since we already said that those are more satisfying, then it seems that the just person's life is happier because it's more pleasurable. And just to repeat, and it's more pleasurable because metaphysical objects can bring more pleasure than physical objects, and only just individuals are able to access metaphysical objects due to the fact that their rational component of mind is functioning properly at that time. So that's the third argument, that the just life is happiest. So just to repeat, argument number one, the just life is happier because being just maintains the conditions of free will. Free will is a key ingredient to happiness. So therefore, unjust people cannot be happy because they lack the capacity for voluntary action. Argument number two, the just life is happier because the just person says it is, and they alone are in a position to judge. Argument number three, the just life is happiest on the grounds that it's more pleasurable, and it's more pleasurable because the just individual can access metaphysical objects, which, because they are more real, are more pleasure producing, and therefore it's more satisfying. So at this point, Socrates offers one final metaphor. It's the metaphor of the man, lion, and beast. And he compares the human mind to, it's like one thing, but it has three parts. So he talks about this creature that's one thing, but has three parts. It has a human part, it has a lion part, and it has a beast part. And he talks about how it's a way to conceptualize the relationships of those parts for both the just and the unjust person. So in the just setup, the human part, which is our rational part, makes a friend with the lion part, which is our high spirit. And together they work to temper the beast. The beast has lots of different heads, some good, some bad, all of them ignorant. And so it's the human and lion's job to sort of feed the good heads, and by good we mean promotes being, and not feed the bad heads, the heads that promote non-being. So that's what we mean by temper the beast. So that's sort of like saying our rational faculty is supposed to control our high spirit to temper our appetites. Now, in the unjust individual, several different things can happen. Sometimes the lion in us gets too strong, and it clouds our judgment. We become so proud that we start to pursue pride for itself, as if it were its own goal. And when we do that, we fail to reason about whether or not those goals themselves are honorable. So just to repeat, one unjust setup, right, one unjust scenario that you should consider is that when the lion in us, or our high spirit, becomes the dominant force, that instead of working as a helper to our rational priorities, it sets itself as the only priority, and therefore lacks a guide as to how to achieve that priority in an honorable way. One real example of this is people who sometimes cheat to win at games, and then they're proud of themselves for winning. Most games, let's say basketball, is defined by a set of rules. right? And if you break the rules, then you weren't playing basketball. So if you're proud of yourself for winning a game that you cheated at, you didn't technically win the game. So what are you proud about? So this is an example of someone's pride kind of working independently of rational guidance. We should be proud of our accomplishments, but it doesn't make sense to be proud of things we didn't accomplish. But that's what sometimes happens when people's high spirits, their pride becomes too strong. Another possibility is that the beast in us can recondition the lion in us to work for it against our rational faculty. Sort of like our desire for food or alcohol becoming so strong that it reconditions the way that we feel pride in reference to itself. So we take pride in overeating and overdrinking, and we take shame in moderation. That's backwards, he says. And eventually what will happen is the human in us, our rational faculty, will break down, that it will lack that clarity of thought that is necessary for voluntary action and higher metaphysical pleasures. The third thing that can happen is the beast doesn't recondition the lion, but the beast has the power in some cases to kill the lion. It destroys our sense of shame and pride altogether. And that lion was really important because our appetites become so strong, our rational faculty needed pride as an agent, as a tool, in order to temper that beast in us. So he's always emphasized the kind of rationally guided pride, and that's a proper pride. But if pride dies altogether, right, then that smallest and rarest but finest element of humanity that's inside of us, our rational faculty, it's defenseless, and it lacks the capacity to enact its wisdom upon the self. So that even if you possess some degree of wisdom, if pride is not intact, you will not be able to maintain that wisdom over time. So eventually the beast, once it kills the lion, will go and corrupt the human in us as well and take away our capacity for rational thought. Okay, so there were sort of three unjust scenarios. You have beast, in order, you have lion takes over the mind for itself. You have beast corrupts lion, retrains it in reference to its beastly goals, and together they take over the mind. And then you have the beast kills the lion, and it takes over the mind. And in all three of those scenarios, both the first and the third argument against injustice that we just discussed would be in effect. That person will be unhappy. Of course, it is helpful to understand this back in terms of his original metaphor of reason, spirit, appetite. So lion taking over mind equals high spirit dominating rationality and appetite. If to say the beast kills the lion, that simply means that the appetitive kills the high spirit and then corrupts reason. So it's helpful to be able to think of things in both frames of reference, and to be able to explain it as both a metaphor of man, lion, beast, but also of reason, spirit, appetite. Okay, that's the conclusion of Book 9. At this point, most of the people that he's talking to seem to be convinced. Glaucon especially seems to assent to the argument and say that he's right. Book 10 is a sort of an appendix book. It has some interesting information. He has an argument against art in Book 10, claiming that artists, both literary and dramatic, and even painters, I suppose, they're not the best because of two separate arguments. The first is they create images of physical objects or representations, but then they pass them off as being the real thing. But they're not the real thing. And so they're in the business of operating on the very bottom of the divided line. So I was trying to connect to that. Say I wanted to write a book about what it's like to be a fisher person in the Northeast today. I suppose I would do research. I would go and live amongst the people who were in that industry, take notes, and then I'd go use those notes to form the basis of my book. But that's inherently superficial, right? Because I'm creating a kind of perspective on this based upon my own limited images, and then I write that book, then other people read that book and they form an image of that industry based on what I wrote. But none of that is true to what that industry actually is. And so he thinks that that's what literary people do, is that they create these representations of real things, but that those representations are inherently less real. And so they confuse and then make people think things are true when they're actually only less real versions of an actual thing. The second argument is that most writing encourages the appetitive parts of our mind and not our rational parts. That, for example, comedy and tragedy have an element of cruelty involved in them. And so when we find ourselves watching certain television shows or reading certain books, and those books or shows are funny, there's usually some element of cruelty connected to that comedy. Most jokes have a butt of the joke. And he says that's fundamentally an antisocial behavior. And so if we're trying to build a perfect state, it doesn't make sense to encourage people to be cruel. So the entire book ends with a story of a guy named E.R. And it's pretty dramatic. It's Plato's introduction. In a later book, Plato argues for the immortality of the soul in a dialogue called the Phaedo. And there's a prototype version of that in the end of the Republic. It's a neat story. The guy dies, but he's not really dead. He pops up, and then he communicates what he witnessed of the afterlife to other people. Socrates is speculating. He's not presenting any of it as argumentation or as factual, but he ends it in a kind of dramatic myth, which is kind of a fun story to read. It would make a good movie. And that concludes Plato's Republic. I hope you've enjoyed what you've learned, and I hope mainly that this book has encouraged you to think about the connection between moral virtue, between justice and wisdom, and then their connection to happiness. And his point was to prove that being a happy person really does mean that you are a good person. And that is because the qualities that good people have allow them to function and properly and to succeed. That's a neat argument, and I hope you enjoyed it.